I'm afraid I have no Cinderella-related images, so we'll just stick with the numbers, which in some ways is actually much less attractive. So for the next few minutes, I'll just sort of go through sort of the broad, and it really is a broad overview. So the whole area of government, or local government finance and local government funding, is quite complex, and it's something that will, given the nature of the Assembly's deliberations over the coming months, we'll be able to drill down to in much more detail. So this is really about giving you sort of the headline figures and sort of the headline categories. I'm just looking at Dublin City Council for illustrated purposes, okay? So that's not anything about South Dublin or Fingal or Dundee or Down. It was just easier to look at one local authority and provide sort of the pie charts and what it looks like there. So if we look at sort of our local government system, it's largely funded through four sort of categories of payment. Money from the local government fund, which I'll come back to, charges for goods and services, which we'll get into in some detail, specific state grants, where the central state national government provides a grant to deliver a very particular service, and A would have mentioned that earlier on, that's something we've seen more and more of, where central government is providing a very specific sum of money to deliver a very specific project. And it's, you could argue it's a way where the autonomy of the local authority system, the Irish local government system, has been reduced, because you actually have these direct lines of accountability and funding to a central government department, rather than through decisions made by local councillors at local council. And then finally, rates, which we can talk about in more detail. Now, I make the point there that making the budget is a reserve function. I should really say passing the budget is a reserve function. Given the complexity of the budget and the organisation, you could argue that the heavy lifting is done by the staff. A draft budget is presented to the council, and they go through the deliberations until it's passed. So while it is a reserve function, it's worth bearing in mind that when we talked earlier on about if you look at the expert knowledge within the staff cohort of the local authority system, they really are the ones who actually have probably the best idea of actually how the budget works. They've got the expert knowledge. And that's not a slight on the councillors. It's just the way any complex sort of local government decision-making system is probably likely to work. But it's worth thinking about that through over the coming weeks. The coming months and the coming sessions. So if you look at the local government fund, and so just a couple of things to bear in mind. The big chunk of change there looks 2016 as 1.8 billion. Now that changed in 2017, and the latest data we have is for 2020, and it's different because of COVID. So if you sort of broadly, local property taxes were about 25% of the sum. So that's all the local property tax collected in Ireland, going to government department and then brought back out. That's about 25%. It's now in 2020, the latest figures, it's about 32%. So I think a 1.57 billion figure for the total local government fund in 2020, and about 481 million in local government, or in local property tax. And the key issue there is that motor tax revenue, which used to go into the local government fund, now goes into central government. Okay, so motor tax revenues, which were a huge part of the local government system, an income stream over many years. From 2017, they began to go directly into into central government. So it skews the figures a little. It's just sort of important to bear that in mind. You then have sort of direct payments from the Exchequer. When you look at charges for goods and services, so councils receive payments for services they provide: housing, rent, waste charges, parking charges, planning application fees, and many of those they're set locally, though some are fixed at a national level. If you think about the because there's issues about access to information and actually facilitating access to particular application processes, so you try and keep the fee low. But that's a direct source of income, is through fees. And then we briefly mentioned already the sort of specific state grants, often around housing and road maintenance. And then we have rates. So there's an obligation to levy rates on properties in the authority area. Now, rates are an unusual form of fundraising. They're quite complex in terms of actually how the rates are set. We're really talking about commercial rates. Historically, we would have had domestic rates and agricultural rates. So we had a broader tax base for our local government system. In 1977, I think operational in 1978, we saw domestic rates, we talked about being abolished, and we were sort of joking about it earlier on over coffee. They weren't really abolished. Just, the money that was meant to was, instead of going into local authorities and into central government, it was then to come back into local authorities. But over the years, that became less and less. And the same with agricultural rates. So the tax base of local authorities has been narrowing over decades. Okay, and that's important in terms of planning and investment. Your ability to actually plan forward in terms of actually having a very good idea of what your income stream is. You want a broad tax base, arguably, that sort of removes some of the uncertainty and instability in the economic cycle and variations in economic activity. So that rates issue, I'm sure it's something that will come up again and again over the next number of sessions. So if we just look at Dublin, and I know there's text and there's some very bad colours there. There's a website which we'll provide a link to you later on. Our colleagues in what's now the University of Galway, they actually look at every local authority and they look at their income and expenditure, and they provide much better pie charts than I've done. But just to give you a rough idea, just looking at Dublin, and bear in mind it's Dublin City Council, it's not the other three, but just for illustrative purposes, for 2022, the budget is 1.13 billion, so it's about just over €2,000 per person. Where's that money goes? You see it goes in housing, roads, water, development management, and really you're talking there about things like tourism, heritage, development enforcement, planning enforcement, environmental services. The big one there is actually fire. So the fire brigade in Dublin comes in on environmental services, street cleaning, litter cleaning, they all go in there. Then you have water, which is planning for water services as much as water provision. Then things like your recreation and amenities, libraries, sports, outdoor parks, tourism, they all come under there. So fairly straightforward. We can plug into the detail in the coming sessions, but you get a fairly good idea, hopefully, of where the money is spent. But if we look at actually where the money is coming from, so just under a third of the income comes from commercial rates, 2% comes from local property tax. I should have actually done one of those questions earlier and said, how many people here think property tax pays more than 10% or 15%? It's a relatively small amount of money. We are a bit of an outlier, and we can deal with that later on in sort of the deliberations, providing the data and actually where we're different in terms of how we do property tax. The goods and services we sell, so really you're talking there about again, parking fees, planning, rental income for local authority houses. Then you have the grants and subsidies, and we talked about those earlier on about direct grants from central government in terms of housing, building and roads. So I may leave it at that. Again, as I said, it's really high level. It's just to give you a breakdown of the categories that they make sense. We'll provide a link to sort of the national website, all the local authorities. You can access the data there. And I may just leave it at that and we'll go on into the session.